All right, so this is just real quick. We're going to talk about the difference between archaea and bacteria. So you got a couple of questions in your first 9 weeks test that were about archaea versus bacteria. What's the difference? Well, let's talk about how they are the same first. So once again, there's two kinds of bacteria, okay? There's what we call archaea bacteria, and there's what we call eubacteria, or just bacteria, okay? No one ever says eubacteria. It's just bacteria, all right? I'm just trying to be official. It's just two different kinds of bacteria. Now, let's say we have a Venn diagram with archaea on one side and eubacteria on the other. So let's first talk about what they have in common, okay? Well, we know that they're both bacteria. And because they're bacteria, we know that there's only two kinds of cells in the whole world. Every living thing is made up of one of two kinds of cells, either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Remember, the way to think about that is either bacteria or not bacteria. If it's bacteria, it's prokaryotic. If it's not bacteria, if it's anything but bacteria, anything, as long as it's not bacteria, it's eukaryotic, okay? So because these are both bacteria, we know that they must also be prokaryotic. Okay? Now, prokaryotic cells, the thing that makes the difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell is the presence of a nucleus, okay? Now, all cells have DNA, so these guys both also have DNA because all cells have DNA. However, not all cells have a nucleus where that DNA is inside, okay? Bacteria, prokaryotes, they don't have a nucleus. Their DNA is just floating around freely inside their body, okay? It's kind of like if your organs weren't nice and secure and in place, they just kind of floated around. Sometimes your heart was down here, sometimes your stomach was up here. They would just kind of float around. That's kind of how bacterial cells work. The stuff inside just kind of moves around willy-nilly, okay? So they do have DNA, but they don't have a nucleus, so no nucleus. All right? So that's what they have in common. But let's talk about what makes them different, okay? So what makes them different is their cell walls. Once again, the biggest difference between these two types of bacteria are their cell walls. Got it? They both have them. They both have cell walls. It's just their cell walls are made up of different stuff. That's important. I'll explain why that's important in just a second. Okay? All right. So, regular bacteria have cell walls that are made up of this stuff called, and I know it's a big word, and I hate that everything in the subject that I teach is big words that scare people. But it's peptidoglycan. I'm sorry it's such a big word, okay? Peptidoglycan is a molecule that bacterial cell walls are made up of. It basically just means protein and sugar. Peptido means it's talking about proteins, and glycan, like glycogen, is a sugar. It's basically proteins and sugars, okay? Does this make sense? Proteins and sugars is basically what that means, all right? But archaea cell walls, these archaea bacteria, they have cell walls that are made up of lipids and proteins. Now, why is that so important? Why does having a different kind of cell wall make these bacteria have to be completely separate things just because their cell wall is a little different? Well, the reason is because these bacteria, archaea, because their cell walls are made differently from regular bacteria, they're able to survive in very strange places that you would not think anything could survive in. For instance, volcanoes. Would you think that anything could survive inside of a volcano with all that searing heat and lava and the poisonous gases that if you breathe them in, they'll kill you? You may not think that anything could live there, but you find these guys living there happily. You may not think that they could live in very acidic places where if you touched it, it would burn your skin off. But these guys comfortably live there. There's lots of different kinds of archaea bacteria. Some live in places where it's extremely hot, like inside of a volcano. Some live in places where it's extremely cold. Okay? The point is, they live in extreme environments. Extreme environments. And eubacteria, they live in normal environments. Just like here, right now. This is normal, right? This is where you would find normal bacteria. But if you find something inside of a volcano, some bacteria, that's an extreme environment. That's going to be archaea bacteria. And what allows them to live there, again, is because they have these cell walls that are made up in a certain way that allow them to be able to withstand the high heat or the freezing temperatures or the really acidic acids, okay? And that's basically it. That's what you need to know about the difference between these two types of bacteria. It's really just the cell wall and the environments that they live in. Okay. One other thing that you need to know is aerobic versus anaerobic. Have you guys ever heard these words before? Okay, let me tell you what they mean. Aero means air. So we know that they're talking about air, but in this case, specifically oxygen. Okay? We're talking about oxygen. Aerobic organisms love oxygen. Anaerobic organisms hate oxygen. In other words, you know how we need oxygen to live? Well, it's because we're aerobic. But to some things, oxygen is actually poisonous and will kill them. For instance, anaerobic bacteria. Bacteria can either be aerobic and love oxygen, or they can be anaerobic and oxygen kills them. Okay? But there's different levels of tolerance of oxygen, okay? So there's what we call strict aerobes. There's what we call strict anaerobes. There's what we call facultative anaerobes. And there's what we call microaerophiles. It'll all make sense in a second. When you see the word strict, what do you think of? Really hard line, my way or the highway, right? If your parents are really strict, this is the way it is, and there's no getting around it, right? So a strict aerobe is someone who has to have oxygen, absolutely has to. Remember, aerobe, they love oxygen. They have to have it. There's no other way. It's a strict rule, okay? So they need O2. Let me change that to must have O2. A strict anaerobe, if a strict aerobe must have O2, what do you think a strict anaerobe? Must not have O2. Must not. Any amount of oxygen will kill it. Okay? Must not have O2. Okay? Facultative anaerobe, what that means is that they can kind of go with or without. They prefer, they're anaerobic, so they prefer no O2, but can live with a little. It's like something with you guys, like, well, I prefer not to do this thing, but I'm okay as long as I only have to do it a little. Just like with these guys, they prefer no oxygen, but they can live with a little. So they're called facultative anaerobe. Microaerophile is the opposite. It's just the flip of that. They prefer oxygen, they prefer O2, but they could live without it as long as it's just a little, right? As long as they have a little bit, they're okay. So they prefer O2, but can live without for a little, okay? So, that's everything you need to know to be able to answer those questions.